Joseph, knowing that his brothers have committed evil against him, knowing that what they did was wrong, knowing even that God had actually restrained their evil. I don't know why God didn't just put them in a situation where they would do freely, but God actually restrains men's evil. God actually hardens men's hearts in other situations. Why would he need to do any of this if he has just put them in situations where they act freely? But in the situation of what the brothers did to Joseph, God specifically says through Scripture, you meant this for evil. He does not excuse their sin. He does not say, oh, you're just puppets on a string, so it doesn't really matter. He knew what filled their hearts. He knew that God had restrained them from killing him. And yet, in the very same sentence, he says, God intended it for good and to save many alive to this day. He uses the exact same Hebrew term in both places. It can't be avoided. And so in one horrific act, I mean, think of the evil of the brothers in deceiving their father in his grieving and wailing and sending their brother off into slavery. This is horrible stuff. And yet God intended it for good. And so whatever you do, if you take Scripture as the highest norm, as Jesus taught us to, then you have to norm everything else by that. And we are given examples there in Isaiah 10, in Acts chapter 4, of where God's sovereign decree limits man's evil and accomplishes God's purpose through that evil. And that God then judges men, not for their knowledge of a divine decree, but for acting upon the desires of their hearts. That's the basis of what the judgment is made upon. So this has been discussed, and if you want to get real philosophical about it, by Jonathan Edwards and others for quite some time. But I just point out that in dealing with our subject, Molinism, we're dealing with a perspective unknown in the history of the church for 1,500 years. And it doesn't come into expression until someone is seeking to fundamentally undercut the gospel being preached by the reformers, by Calvin and Luther. And so it's a more of a modern situation, but it wasn't something that people reading Scripture for 1,500 years said, oh yeah, there it is. And I think that's very, very important. I want to be able to expand upon that.
There's a number of objections there, Bill, coming back at you in that sense. But I mean, let's take the that example from Scripture, Joseph and his brothers. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. I mean, is that a kind of a good example of Calvinism, or could it just as equally be applied to
it's a great example of Molinism. I love the Joseph story because it so perfectly illustrates human freedom within the providence of God. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good and has brought it to pass. God didn't move the brothers to hate Joseph, to kill him, to throw him into a pit, to lie to their father. That would make God the author of evil. But God knew that if they were in this situation, they would behave in these evil ways, but that ultimately this would redound to the salvation of Israel and its rescue from famine and all the rest. So this is a story that wonderfully illustrates, I think, how Molinism resolves the antinomy of human freedom and evil and God's sovereign providence.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.